Now, I must say, mobocracy is not new in America. In fact, I think the best way to understand the concept is by understanding it through evaluating the history of ideas. So, in America, mobocracy has flared up in certain parts of the country, but also then flared down. But even over the past few years, we've seen instances of it. So more recently, for example, during the George Floyd protests, that was a clear example of mobocracy. If we define mobocracy as simply, some people would say mob rule, or I would simply say the actions of a mass group of people acting in a violent way or a coercive way or an antisocial way, i.e. in a way that harms civil society by violating justice, controlling the governing mechanisms of a country or effecting law and policy. That's mobocracy. And we'll get into that more in a second as well. If we define it as that, then clearly the George Floyd protests were emblematic of mobocracy. The fact that Minneapolis and several other cities across the nation suspended their protection of individual life and property rights to give way to a sort of social justice furor that ended up burning down entire sections of cities, that ended up destroying businesses, destroying economies, and wrecking lives, all in the name of pursuing this grandiose idea of justice relating to a case that I think did not warrant that level of, or never can warrant that level of behavior. That was a clear instance of mobocracy. We've seen across, for example, the world, we've seen different protests, especially mass resistance protests from Muslims who believe that certain host countries that they've come from or come into by ways of immigration are not treating them right. And so we've seen mass resistance protests where there's oftentimes violence. We've seen, for example, in the UK, we've even seen more subtle influences of mobocracy. We've seen in the UK entire communities and streets being governed by Sharia law, and police officers not even willing to operate in those streets because they personally believe if they do so, they could be causing an offense or might cause trouble. For a very long time, the idea of grooming gangs was considered to be weird and considered to be a right-wing talking point, but it's actually, unfortunately, a reality throughout northern France and throughout England. Chaz and Chop in Seattle, the seizure of an entire community for the sake of a sort of terroristic goal from Antifa, the Capital Autonomous Zone, that's also another instance of recent mobocracy. So mobocracy is not necessarily new.